Imagine you're sitting on the banks of the river and you look up and you see coming at you across the sky is some crazy, gigantic vehicle of some kind. But it's not just a vehicle. It looks like it's part biology, part technology, and it's got some kind of core engine that seems to be like just molten hot fire, like the embers inside a fire, and it's coming closer and closer to you. And as it gets closer to you, you look up and you see that it's some kind of giant throne structure with wings and wheels, and on top of it is a person of some kind, a magnificent person, and it starts talking to you and telling you to do stuff. That sounds like an LSD trip, but it's in fact what happens to the prophet Ezekiel in the book of Ezekiel in the Bible. And it's a fascinating story, and it has sort of led to a lot of head scratching for thousands of years as to what he was actually seeing. Not only is it bizarre in its own right, like within the sort of realm of biblical story or within the realm of just, hallucinations and visions, it's also gotten a lot of attention for being possibly a description of an early encounter with a UFO. Now, that view, not shared by the majority, but a minority of people, find these passages very convincing. There's a wheel inside of a wheel, and in this wheel, which is moving, also there appears to be eyes and limbs of some kind, like wings. And these are called, in the Bible, Ophanim, or Ophanim, which literally is from the Hebrew word which means wheel. So these are very strange wheels out of the sky, and seems to be a being which in the Bible turns out to be God, of course, telling you to go and warn God's people that they're basically being screw-ups and they need to get their shit together, or they're basically going to be completely annihilated. So this is Ezekiel's job, and that's how the book of Ezekiel begins in the Bible. Today we're going to look at the Ophanim, and we're going to try to understand what were these strange wheel beings or living mechanisms. Why would Ezekiel see them? What do they mean? We're going to talk a little bit about angelology, like the system of different kinds of angels, seraphim, cherubim, Ophanim, and so forth. And then we're going to talk about why some people think these may in fact be early descriptions of encounters with UAPs, or unidentified anomalous phenomena. So strap in. Welcome to Professor Asma's Guide to Unusual Knowledge. So let's begin by talking a little bit about who Ezekiel is. Ezekiel basically is a prophet, and he's living in Jerusalem, and the Babylonians basically invade Jerusalem and they take a bunch of captives. And he ends up being one of these captives who's dragged back to Babylonia, and he lives there for something like 5 or 6 years. And when the book of Ezekiel begins, we meet him sitting on the riverside. And then he has this crazy encounter with some kind of flaming chariot. So Ezekiel goes back to Jerusalem. God gives him a kind of scroll to eat. And the idea is that once he's eaten this scroll, he will be able to speak God's message in a compelling way. But when he goes back to Israel, he doesn't get a lot of attention, and the message sort of falls on deaf ears. And so he begins doing a kind of weird street theater, where he's basically doing these kinds of performative signs. Like he builds like a little model of Jerusalem, and then he destroys it, and he does a whole bunch of sort of stuff like out in the street to kind of perform what's coming for people if they don't get their morality back in shape. Then he has another sort of vision while he's there, and that's when the Ophanim, or this sort of incredible chariot of God is described again. And in that description, it's even more intense. So let me read to you just a little bit from Ezekiel 1, and then we'll read from Ezekiel 10 in just a bit. So in Ezekiel 1, the passage here, and this is translated from the Hebrew, "And I saw, and behold, a tempest was coming from the north, a huge cloud and a flaming fire with a brightness around it. And from its midst it was like the color of the cosmal, from the midst of the fire." In other words, like the hottest embers inside the sort of charcoal embers inside the fire. "And from its midst was the likeness of 4 living beings, and this is their appearance. They had the likeness of a man, and each one had 4 faces, and each one had 4 wings." Okay, this is kind of amazing. So picture these 4 creatures sort of on the sides of this throne, or on the sort of 4 corners of the throne. "And I saw the living beings, and behold, one wheel was on the ground beside the living beings for its 4 faces." So underneath these 4 creatures is basically a giant wheel that's spinning inside another wheel. The appearance of the wheels and their work was like the appearance of crystal, and the 4 of them had one likeness, and their appearance and their workings were as a wheel would be within a wheel. So that's the sort of first formulation of this crazy Ophanim. I don't know whether at this point whether it's a mechanism or whether it's a creature. "When they went toward their 4 sides. They did not turn when they went, and they had backs, and they were very high, and they were dreadful, and their eyebrows were full of eyes round about. So it was to the 4 of them." Now this is an interesting passage because we're in Ezekiel 1, and we don't know what the eyes are referring to here. And we're going to hear in Ezekiel 10, all this is redescribed, and there it becomes a little clearer. But these 4 beings that are on the 4 sides of this chariot generally are considered to be, and they're named later, as cherubim. So these are kinds of angels that you've probably heard of. In fact, you've probably seen cherubim like in paintings from the Renaissance, and it's sort of like cute little babies with wings floating around a Michelangelo painting or something. This is quite different. This is very sort of disturbing. "And when the living beings would go, the wheels would go beside them, and when the living beings would lift themselves off the ground, the wheels would lift themselves. Wherever there was the will to go, they would go. There was the will to go, and the wheels would lift themselves correspondingly to them, for the will of the living being was in the wheels." So you have a kind of living machine being described here, where the cherubim are sort of moving around, and basically as they move, the whole chariot moves, but the wheels, which are not attached to them and yet underneath them, are moving wherever they go. So it's a very peculiar sort of motion and basically strange combination of a living and artificial thing. Then it says here, "And there was a voice above the expanse that was over their heads. When they stood still, they would let down their wings. And above the expanse that was over their heads, like the appearance of a sapphire stone, was the likeness of a throne. And on the likeness of the throne was a likeness like the appearance of a man upon it above." This is basically God, Yahweh. "And I saw like the color of cosmal," again, the sort of inner fire, "like the appearance of fire within it around about, from the appearance of his loins and above, and from the appearance of his loins and below, I saw a thing like the appearance of fire, and there was a brightness round about it." So God, with flaming groin, is riding on top of this throne, and there's beings holding it up, and there's spinning wheels inside wheels underneath the beings. Okay, it even gets weirder than this, but that's the beginning of Ezekiel. It's great stuff. It's just fantastic. Okay, what does it mean? First of all, we have to ask ourselves, when you have a vision like this in the Bible or really in any of the great spiritual traditions, or honestly just when your friend is tripping on LSD, what is going on? Like, how do we know the difference between a hallucination versus a vision? And it's also possible that it could be both. It could be that you're having a hallucination that has a change in an altered state of your brain, but it could also be a message from God or from the divine other side. They don't rule each other out entirely. Some people will say, well, once you've given a sort of brain explanation of a vision, you're sort of done and it's been reduced to science, but that's not necessarily true. If you're a believer, you can still have God as the ultimate cause of the brain change, which would be the proximate change or the proximate cause of your vision. So in this case, what's happening? Well, of course, it's the Bible. We don't really know, and we don't have science that can give us access to what was happening at the time, but we do know a lot about what is happening in the brain when coherent perception breaks down and you have essentially a psychedelic experience. I mean, there's a huge kind of, liminal space between coherent experience of waking life, where things are predictable and make sense, and the completely, incoherent sense of like surrealism. And there's this interesting middle ground or liminal territory, which has a kind of narrative structure to it, sort of like dreams do. So waking dreams, really. We think that there's a part of the brain, or sort of a whole system of the brain, called the default mode network, and this is usually very activated during these kinds of experiences. We also know that when you essentially give classical psychedelics to subjects, whether they're mice or human beings, they seem to trip balls. And the reason that's happening is because there is something within LSD, psilocybin, and DMT, for example, that acts like serotonin. So it basically doesn't produce more serotonin, but it actually is a kind of, it comes into the system and masquerades as serotonin. So basically it attaches to the 2A serotonin receptors in the brain, of which there are many, and this basically breaks down the coherence of your experience, and you get the trippy psychedelic experience. We know that the 2A receptors are extremely important to psychedelic experience because if you block those 2A receptors, through an experiment, and then you administer LSD, the person doesn't trip. So you can sort of stop that sort of substance from acting like serotonin and causing this breakdown in coherence by simply blocking these 2A receptors. Now, is it possible that Ezekiel is having a sort of increased serotonin vision? Entirely possible. There's other ways to get this kind of experience that also involve things like meditation, diet, breathing, exercises, just staying up too long. All that stuff can be real. It's also possible that God came to him on a flaming, chariot and told him to do this. I'm not ruling that out, but as a show that's sort of, interested in science, in addition to these sort of spiritual matters, we got to try to tell the whole story. So that is a fascinating issue, and you'll notice that we live in an era where religion is oftentimes thought of as being, institutional and sort of the voice of, middle class bourgeois morality. But that's really not true. Religion is oftentimes bound up with the psychedelic experience. If you go back in Hinduism to the early texts of the Vedas, you'll find that for the most part, the sort of cosmology of Hinduism is developed in tandem with drinking a hallucinogenic substance called soma. And you'll see this in ancient Greek and Egyptian religion too, that oftentimes there's an altered state of consciousness that's connected to the religious experience. So the fact that we find this in the Bible, the psychedelic experience, that is to say, shouldn't be that surprising. A lot of us have not had these experiences in religion, but some of us have. Okay, the next thing for us to discuss is a little bit of angelology. So you've had the vision, you're Ezekiel on the riverside. It looks like it's these spinning wheels that have eyes. Are they angels or are they just weird mechanisms? And there's a lot of debate about this because we know of other angels that are clearly described in the Bible. And then there's sort of apocryphal books of the Bible that don't make it into the official Bible, but they are nonetheless extremely important. One of those, for example, is the book of Enoch, and Enoch 2. These books basically were very influential. Eventually they were sort of pulled out of the canon, but they are then discovered again much later when in the 20th century the Dead Sea Scrolls are uncovered. And we see again the Book of Enoch and other books like this. And so we know that they were highly influential. In the Book of Enoch, the Ophanim, these wheels with eyes, are also described as angels. And so we want to talk a little bit about the types of angels that are described within the Judeo-Christian tradition. And first and foremost, we have the seraphim and the cherubim. And these, again, have been sort of treated as cute little babies floating around in Renaissance paintings and sort of romantic paintings, but really they're much more scary. So they're described in Isaiah as being composed of fire. The cherubim, or the cherubim in Hebrew, are described as basically guardians of the Garden of Eden. So remember, in the Garden of Eden, Adam and Eve eat of the forbidden fruit and are kicked out. And then to guard the gate back into Eden, the seraphim and the cherubim are placed. And there they're described as having a kind of flaming sword. So they're standing guard. They also are described as having, in some places, as having eyes all over themselves and on their wings. There's a wonderful sort of stained glass window in the Cathedral of Chartres in France, where there's an angel and the angel is covered in eyes. It's just a remarkable stained glass window. And you look at it and you just think, this is so bizarre, and yet it's a reference to the cherubim, seraphim tradition. And these are sort of designed to be looking everywhere. So these are the sort of looking out for God, looking out for sin, looking out to punish the ne'er-do-wells and so forth. So this is a tradition that we know pretty well. Now the question is, are the Ophanim part of this angelology? Are they another species of angel? There's another kind of angel that's described in the Book of Enoch, which is fascinating, and it's part of another sort of story that was very popular in the ancient world, but it really didn't get into the official canon, and yet you may be familiar with it from other sources of mythology. These are the Watchers. These are fallen angels. In Greek, they're called the Gregori. And in Hebrew, they're called the B'nai Ha-Elohim. So these Watchers, in Hebrew, the sons of God, are basically looking down on the earth and they see human women and they take a fancy to them because they are fine. And when they see them, they're like, hey, we should mate with these women. They're really good looking, they seem talented and smart, and let's get down there. So they go down and they mate with human women. Now, this is not what God wants, apparently, according to the Book of Enoch, and the resulting babies that they have are basically called the Nephilim, or the giants. And what happens is the giants grow to be huge, and they start to cause all kinds of just havoc and chaos. It's total mayhem. They start eating everything. They're just eating trees and other human beings. They're eating each other. It's just nuts. And God looks down on this and goes, look, this is a disaster, and this is all your fault, he says to the fallen angels. You shouldn't have mated with human women. It's interesting, too, that the fallen angels give women magic. This is kind of a side story, which is worth just mentioning parenthetically, that they teach women all this great stuff about how to sort of understand roots and sort of natural folk medicines, and also how to cast spells. And for this, God is also upset. But I find that very interesting, sort of that there's a sort of a origin story of magic in the Book of Enoch. And in any case, they all need to be punished according to Yahweh. And so what he does is he sends the flood. Now, we know a different flood story in mainstream religion, which is God sees human beings being jerks and he sends the flood, and he has Noah build the ark, and he saves the animals 2 by 2. But in the Book of Enoch, it's the giants, and by extension, the Watchers, who have caused all this misery. So the flood is sent to kill the giants. And then in the Book of Enoch, which I highly recommend you read, Enoch goes and, they're all destroyed during the flood, and he goes to see them in hell. And so that's a really wonderful, amazing adventure too. So anyway, my point is, you've got seraphim, you've got cherubim, you've got the Watchers, the Gregori, and then you've got this possible wheel angels or throne angels called the Ophanim. Let's talk a little bit more about the Ophanim as they appear in Ezekiel 10, because this is where it gets really fascinating. Okay, in Ezekiel 10, God shows Ezekiel another vision, and this time he shows him the same kind of throne, which has the cherubim on the four corners, and they're flaming and there's fire coming out of them as they fly around with their Ophanim wheels. And there's in the dream sort of vision state, Ezekiel sees another man, and God tells this man to go reach into the cherubim and take fire from them, and then use that fire to destroy, the land of these immoral people. And this is going to be the punishment for their immorality. So, and during that description, we get a better description of the Ophanim. When the Lord commanded the man in linen, take fire from among the wheels, from among the cherubim, the man went in and stood beside a wheel. Then one of the cherubim reached out his hand to the fire that was among them, took up some of it and put it in the hands of the man in linen, who took it and went out. Under the wings of the cherubim could be seen what looked like human hands. I looked, says Ezekiel, and I saw beside the cherubim 4 wheels, one beside each of the cherubim. The wheels sparkled like topaz. As for their appearance, the 4 of them looked alike. Each was like a wheel intersecting a wheel. So here's sort of a redescription all the way from Ezekiel 1. This is an important point. There's a lot of redundancy in scriptures, a lot of sort of redescriptions of the same thing, which is kind of fun because it gives you more and more detail on it. As they moved, they would go in any one of the 4 directions the cherubim faced. The wheels did not turn about as the cherubim went. The cherubim went in whatever direction the head faced without turning as they went. This is a strange sort of propulsion detail to include, I think, in a vision. I just think it's great. The cherubim went in whatever direction the head faced without turning as they went. Their entire bodies, including their backs, their hands, and their wings, were completely full of eyes, as were their 4 wheels. So here is the clearest expression. In other words, the cherubim are covered in eyes, but also the wheels are covered in eyes. Okay, I want us to think for a moment about the idea of a living machine. I find this a remarkable kind of entity. And, there's not a lot of this. There's usually like mashups of different zoological categories in ancient religion or in mythology, where you have sort of snakes mixed with, bats to turn into dragons, or you have humans mixed with horses to turn into centaurs. That zoological mixing is pretty common. But mixing together biology and artificial machinery is something quite rare and very intriguing. This is one of the reasons why I think many people think that it might be sort of a UAP, an early experience of a UAP. I want to point out to you that there is a kind of theory in cognitive science which says that we can understand religion and mythology and storytelling as a series of category violations, where you have a sort of category of things that are, flying things, and you have a category of things that are slithering things on the ground, and a good religion or story or mythology will mix these 2 things together. And that's how you get these sort of category mashups or hybrid creatures. The reason why this is important is because it arouses cognitive, attention. And so stories that have these mixes of creatures really do go very far. They're what's sometimes called sticky memes. You remember them. So you'll look at Hinduism, for example, and you have Ganesh, which is a mix of sort of an Indian elephant and a human. And these kind of humanoid animal mix-ups are very sort of at the center of religion and mythology. I think if you look at the category of things like a river, which is inanimate but moving, and you add something like an animate quality, then you get what we call animism, which is the earliest form of religion we have. You'll see this in, let's say, Hayao Miyazaki films, the great Japanese imagination, Hayao Miyazaki, where you'll see films like Spirited Away or Totoro, where nature has spirits built into them. And this is true also in Native American religion, where the tree, the river, the rock, the mountain has a personality. And this is an interesting thing if you think about it from the point of view of cognitive science and cultural anthropology, because what you're doing is you're taking two different categories and you're mixing them together. The inanimate and the animate, the natural and the human psyche. So this is sort of a combination of something maybe being an animal, but also having a kind of human personality, or being alive like a tree and having something like a humanoid personality. So the idea here is that there are many kinds of persons out in the world, according to animism, and only some of those are human beings. That's really the oldest and probably the most widespread religion on the planet. You'll see it all over in Africa, in Europe, in the Americas, in Asia, and the religions that we're more familiar with, like the monotheisms of Christianity, Judaism, Islam, and even things like Buddhism, are built on top of these older animism traditions. So I just want to point out to you that this category violation that you see in the sort of living chariot of Ezekiel really has grabbed the imagination, and it has really stuck with us. And the reason why this is important is cultural theorists suggest that this is how you create a community around stories that are really memorable and sort of shocking and arousing and draw your attention and stick in the memory. And then you basically build a community around these stories. So it's not just enough to sort of hunt with people and cooperate with them to get food and shelter. It's also important to share imagery and to share stories. And part of that sort of is using these sort of category violations to have good stories. All right, so let's keep this in mind, the living machine idea. This basically is the reason, as I said before, why some people have been drawn to this. Even Carl Sagan, who is by, I think, all descriptions, a secular humanist, a scientific mind, thought that if there was any kind of contact with aliens in a previous era, the place to look for it, he thinks, are in some of these stories from Babylonia, from the Bible, from the religious or mythological traditions. Are there things in there that just don't make sense and that could be references to meeting other technology or other kinds of beings? So even he kept his mind open to this possibility. But it wasn't until sloppier thinkers like Eric von Däniken proposed in the 1970s a kind of chariots of the gods, a sort of ancient astronauts theory. Again, not the first to do it, but probably the most popularizing and best-selling version starting in the 70s. And others have sort of jumped on board with better and worse formulations of this, but it's essentially the ancient astronaut thesis. And you can see a lot of this on TV, you can see a lot of it on YouTube channels, and a lot of it is just really fun. I have no judgment against it, but it's based on very tenuous kinds of redescriptions of ancient texts. But let's look at it and take it seriously for a moment. One of the reasons why people like the idea that the Ophanim could be sort of evidence of ancient astronauts is because it's very weird, as we've been describing, the mix of sort of biological and technological, but also the strange complexity of the technology that's described. This idea of a wheel inside of a wheel, which moves sort of stationarily with other sort of entities. That is something that people look at and they go, oh, it's so complex and weird. It's not like anything else that existed then. So therefore, it might be coming from an alien intelligence. You see this kind of argument a lot when people look at the pyramids and they want to say, well, human beings didn't make this. It must have been made by ancient astronauts. Or an ancient civilization, Atlantis, that's been disappeared from the planet. I'm not entirely sympathetic to this because humans are very clever, and the fact that modern day humans can't figure out how ancient humans did something doesn't mean they didn't do it. So let's bracket that for a moment. But let's consider this more precisely. Were there, in fact, mechanisms like this back, in ancient times? And so let's think of this for a moment. Ezekiel, the book of Ezekiel, purports to be about events that occurred in the 7th or 6th century BC. But in fact, like every other book in the Bible, was written more recently, which is to say, most scholars think the book of Ezekiel was written somewhere in the 4th or 3rd century BC, referring back to something that happened 200 to 300 years before. This is very common. Now, if that's the case, then we do know of some very interesting and complex mechanisms that were built around that time, in particular, the Antikythera mechanism. The Antikythera mechanism, which was discovered in the early 1900s by divers off the coast of a Greek island called Antikythera, basically is an incredibly elaborate machine. And we didn't really even know what it's for. We still don't quite know, but it looks like it's mapping the sort of like changes as you look up into the heavens of planets and stars and constellations, and it looks like it's just a sort of an astronomical guide to the cosmos. But it's the most elaborate machine I think we have found from the ancient world, and as far as we can tell, it seems to have been made during the Hellenistic period, which would be around the time that the book of Ezekiel is being written. We also know that some Roman scholars referred to these machines as going back to the time of Archimedes, that Archimedes might have had one of these and may have built one of these. It actually, if you look at the Antikythera mechanism, it looks like it was definitely built by some kind of little workshop, because it looks way too complex for one person to build. It's an amazing mechanism. But the argument is that maybe Archimedes had made a simpler version of this. So the idea of wheels moving inside wheels is not out of reach at all for this time period. So that's something that I don't think we need to take as seriously from the ancient astronaut argument side of things. It looks like human beings can and did make mechanisms like this. So if you're referring to them within a vision of the Bible, it's entirely reasonable. It's not that strange or miraculous or in need of a special sort of alien explanation. So that's, I think, the important feature, I think, about this argument. I mean, in addition to somebody like Eric von Daniken, who I think we can kind of dismiss, some more serious scholars from the ufology tradition, people like Jacques Vallée, and more recently, a scholar of religion who I have a lot of respect for, Jeffrey Kripal, have argued that at the very least we should keep our minds open to what this is, these ofanim. Like, could it be UAPs? Could it just be some strange kind of category violation of the mind? Could it be some interdimensional sort of crossover from another dimension? And I'm all for keeping the mind open, so I'm in praise of that. But look, whatever the ofanim are, this idea of wheels spinning inside wheels with eyes all around them and wings, it's an amazing work of the imagination or vision, or it's an insight directly into what God wants or what the divine realm is like. I mean, this is sort of an interesting point that is worth making. A lot of us think that if there's a God and if God talks to us in some way, like it's going to be something nice. It's going to be something pleasant and happy and good. That's not necessarily the case. And it's possible that a reality that's so much bigger than this would be a terrifying vision once it's sort of manifested in part into this world. So it's one thing to see a burning bush, which would be cool and weird, but not that scary. But this kind of ofanim vision is frightening and reminds me of other religious traditions, like in the Bhagavad Gita, where there in that great Hindu text, the main character Arjuna is shown the face of God, who's in disguise as his chariot driver. Arjuna says, "Could you show me what your face really is like, God? Show me what the divine universe is like." And Arjuna says, like, "I can take it." And the chariot driver says, "You can't take it, you can't handle it." And finally he shows him by just sort of, for a moment, showing him the divine face. And Arjuna's mind is blown. He's so terrified that he asks him to stop and go back to being the chariot driver. And it's described just for a moment in this incredible poem, the Bhagavad Gita, where all of a sudden the chariot driver becomes like 1,000 eyes, 1,000,000 eyes, 1,000,000 mouths, flesh, flowers, flora, just this psychedelic mishmash of John Carpenter's Thing. I don't know. And that's the kind of thing that one could probably expect if you saw the divine realm in all of its true reality. That is the Ophanim. Keep your eye out for it whenever you're dropping your favorite psychedelic substance. And I'll see you back here next time for Professor Asma's Guide to Unusual Knowledge.